This episode, for reference, because we're going to be dealing with topics that change rather quickly, has been recorded on Friday, the 8th of August, 2025, just for a point of reference. But when we come to Trump and Putin, Trump, I've heard you describe him as transactional. Is the outcome of such a summit, as you've suggested, more likely to be the removal of sanctions and the delay of sanctions, rather, than a proper ceasefire? Is Putin just playing him? Does he understand him well enough to play him?
Putin understands Trump much better than Trump understands Putin.
Yeah.
And it is galling that given all of the expertise that the American system has developed over decades in the Soviet Union and in Russia, that Trump has demonstrated such indifference to truly understanding the nature of the system and the adversary with which he's dealing. He has this supreme belief in his superior ability to do deals. Now, we have not heard anything from President Putin since February 2022 other than a absolutely laser-like focus on dealing with what he calls the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine. And ultimately, that's Kremlin code for the existence of a sovereign, independent, politically autonomous Ukraine that is not subject to veto by the Kremlin. And
in the way that Belarus is.
Well, Belarus is more compliant, but Lukashenko is like that sort of, smelly farting uncle who turns up at the barbecue and none of the family actually wants to sit next to him, but you've got to humour him. But the simple reality is there is a much tighter hold, and there is the union state of Belarus and Russia. But Lukashenko is no pushover, and he's not about to sort of surrender sovereignty. But you can see that once again, in the same way that Boris Yeltsin, who is actually the man who destroyed the Soviet Union, not Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev tried to the very end to preserve a reformed Soviet Union, who was never going to eliminate the Communist Party monopoly on power in practical terms. But Boris Yeltsin, President Shushkevich of Belarus, and President Kuchma of Ukraine signed the Bielovej Accords in September or so of 1991, which essentially declared the Soviet Union as a legal construct has ceased to exist.
Yeah.
And what I think we see Putin doing is seeing that as the core, and the recreation of that is what he is about. So at any time people have talked about ceasefire and end to hostilities or the peaceful resolution of the war that he chose to begin against Ukraine, it's important to remember that at no point has the Kremlin signalled any concession in its core demands, which is essentially Ukrainian neutrality, demilitarization, the replacement of Zelensky, a ban on NATO membership, and a de facto Moscow right to veto foreign and security policy of Ukraine. And so what we now see potentially is Trump in his manic desire to be the ultimate deal maker, willing to give Putin the legitimacy of a bilateral summit. Without, at least in the public domain so far, any sense of there being genuine concessions on the Russian side. And we know that Putin is capable of directing a ceasefire because he unilaterally announced one on the eve of the Victory Day celebrations in May in Moscow. So he has the ability, but he lacks the will to do it in any meaningful way. And Ukraine has been far more forthcoming and genuine in this regard.
But he can make the decision whenever he wants.
If President Trump wants the killing to end in Ukraine, all that has to happen is for President Putin to say, stop. But he keeps raining missiles, glide bombs, drone attacks upon Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and targets in defiance of the laws of armed conflict and in defiance of the treaty that he presided over of 2003, which finally and formally demarcated the common Ukraine-Russian border. That was lodged with the United Nations. President Putin was responsible for foreign policy in 2003, and that clearly demarcated Crimea as within Ukrainian territory.
In 2014, he marched in.
In 2007, he actively supported domestic uprisings
Yes.
and secessionist movements in Donbass.
Yes.
And of course, part of that, as we saw in 2014, was the downing of MH17.
Yeah. So it's rather naive to expect anything other than a temporary halt for tactical purposes and to gull his opposite number in the US into believing he's struck some sort of wonderful deal and last him out.
That is lamentably the case.
Yeah.
And I think for Putin, the very notion of democracy is not something that you can seriously transact with, because Trump will be gone
Yes.
in 2028. And Keir Starmer or Friedrich Merz, anybody who has to be re-elected, is not a long-term partner for Putin. And Xi Jinping is a long-term partner for Putin. And so I think that is something else we've got to get our collective heads around, that is to say, for Putin, it is about the capacity to assert Russia's neo-imperialist designs and interests. And again, we go back to his invocation of the legacy of Yalta and Potsdam.
Yeah.
And for him, Trump is simply, the guy he's got to deal with at the moment, and he's got the read of Trump, I think.
Yeah.
Well, whether he has anything else on Trump is a subject of febrile imagination
I
and
suspect
speculation.